The sun on Aridin Roman 4 was orange and tired, like it had given up trying to be bright a long time ago. It hung low over flat, dusty fields and threw long shadows across the small homestead where Elias Kane lived alone with his dog. Kane was not a young man anymore. His face carried deep lines and old scars that he never talked about. His hands were rough from years of working the dry soil, pulling crops from ground that didn't want to give them up. He wore simple clothes, brown shirt, heavy boots, no markings of any kind. If you saw him in the colony market trading vegetables for water filters, you would think he was just another tired farmer on a forgotten world at the edge of nowhere. That was exactly what he wanted you to think. His homestead was small, a stone house he had built himself, a barn with a rusted metal roof, a garden that grew just enough to keep him fed. No modern technology, no communication screens or data terminals, just a single old commune sitting on the kitchen table that he never turned on. There was nothing on this property that said anything about who Elias Kane used to be, nothing except the memorial marker behind the barn, a simple stone with a name carved into it, his daughter's name. He visited it every morning before the sun came up, and he never spoke about it to anyone. The only living thing that shared his world was Buddy. Buddy was a dog, golden-furred, old and slow. His muzzle had gone white years ago, and his back legs weren't what they used to be. He spent most of his days sleeping on the porch or following Kane around the garden at a lazy pace, tail swinging back and forth like a clock that was running out of time. Kane's daughter had given him the dog. That was before the war, before everything. Buddy was the last piece of a life that didn't exist anymore, and Kane treated him like he was made of glass. He cooked the dog real food, not the cheap nutrient paste that most colonists fed their animals. He talked to Buddy in the evenings while they sat on the porch and watched the orange sun go down. He talked to the dog the way lonely men talk to the only friend they have left. Good boy, he would say, scratching behind the old dog's ears. We're all right, aren't we? And they were for a while. The Gorith arrived on a Tuesday. Their ships came down through the orange sky like black teeth, sharp, angular, ugly. 5 heavy dropships and a command shuttle carrying roughly 300 soldiers of the Gorith Dominion. They were reptilian creatures, tall and thick-scaled, with yellow eyes and mouths full of teeth they liked to show when they talked. They wore dark armor and carried plasma weapons, and they moved with the confidence of predators who had never been truly hurt. The Gorith Dominion was expanding. They had been swallowing up small colonies and unprotected worlds along the frontier for months, and nobody had stopped them because nobody out here was strong enough. The Galactic Union sent warnings, but no ships. The frontier colonies were on their own. The Goreth set up their forward base 2 mi from the main colony settlement. Within hours, their patrols were moving through the streets, smashing market stalls and demanding tribute. They wanted food, water, fuel, and obedience. Mostly obedience. The Goreth liked obedience. The colonists gave in. They had no weapons, no military training, no choice. Some of them wept, some of them stared at the ground, all of them knelt. When they were told to kneel, Kane heard the ships come down. He stood on his porch and watched the black dots settle on the horizon and said nothing. Buddy growled softly beside him, sensing the change in the air. Easy, Cain said. Quietly, not our problem. He went back inside and closed the door. For 3 days, he stayed on his homestead and ignored the world. He could hear distant sounds from the colony, shouting, the hum of Gorith vehicles, the occasional sharp crack of a plasma weapon being fired into the air. He didn't go to investigate. He didn't turn on his commune. He worked his garden, fed his dog, and sat on his porch in the evenings like nothing had changed. He was done with fighting. He had made that decision 10 years ago, and he had kept that promise to himself every day since. Whatever was happening out there was not his war. He had already fought his war. He had given everything he had and more, and the galaxy had taken his battalion, his friends, his health, and his daughter. He had nothing left to give and nothing left to prove. On the 4th day, the Gorith came to him. A patrol of 6 soldiers, led by a captain named Venter, walked up the dirt path to Cain's homestead in the late afternoon heat. Venter was tall even for a Gorath, nearly 7 ft of green-black scales and arrogance. He had gold markings painted on his armor that meant he had killed many enemies, and he walked like someone who expected the ground to thank him for stepping on it. Cain was sitting on his porch when they arrived. Buddy was lying at his feet. Human, Venter said, showing his teeth. You live alone out here? I do, Cain said. You did not come to the settlement to pledge obedience to the Dominion. No, Cain said. I didn't. Venter tilted his head. The other soldiers spread out around the homestead, looking at the small garden and the stone house with amusement. One of them knocked over a water barrel and laughed. You will kneel, Venter said. All beings in this sector kneel before the Gorath. Cain looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were gray and very still. I'm asking you politely, he said. Just leave. Venter stared at him. Then he laughed, a harsh, rattling sound. You are brave for a soft creature, or perhaps stupid. He gestured to his soldiers. Teach this human what happens when he does not kneel. They destroyed his garden first. Plasma blades cut through his crops and scorched the earth black. They kicked in the door of his house and smashed what little he had inside: his table, his chair, the shelf where he kept his books. One of them found the old communit and crushed it under his boot. Cain stood on the porch and watched. His jaw was tight, but he did not move. His fists were closed at his sides, but he did not raise them. Then Buddy growled. The old dog pulled himself up on his stiff legs and stood in front of Cain, teeth bared, hackles raised. He was old and slow and no threat to anything, but he was a dog, and dogs protect the people they love. That is what they do. A Gorith soldier looked down at the animal and drew his plasma blade. The blade hummed bright blue in the dusty air. Cain said, "Don't." The soldier looked at Venter. Venter smiled and nodded. The blade came down. Buddy made one small sound, a whimper, soft and confused, and then he was gone. The Gorith laughed. All of them. They laughed the way predators laugh when they step on something small. Venter looked at Cain and said, "Next time you will kneel." They walked away. Cain didn't watch them go. He was already on his knees, not in submission, but in grief. He gathered Buddy into his arms and held the old dog against his chest. The golden fur was warm, and then it wasn't. The blood soaked into his shirt and into the dry wooden boards of the porch. He stayed there until the sun went down. Then he carried Buddy behind the barn and buried him next to the memorial stone with his daughter's name on it. He stood there in the dark for a long time, looking at the two graves, everything he had ever loved in one small patch of dirt. He didn't cry, he was past that. He walked into the barn. In the far corner, under a heavy tarp and a layer of dust, there was a metal case. He hadn't opened it in 10 years. He knelt down and pressed his thumb to the lock. It clicked open. Inside, the combat suit was exactly as he had left it, scarred, patched, stained with things that would never wash out. The twin rail pistols sat in their mounts, fully charged. The energy blade hummed when he touched it, like it had been waiting. At the bottom of the case, there was a single dog tag. On a chain, it read CDR, ELISKES. Alara Prime, hold the line. He put it around his neck. Then he began to put on the suit. The quiet man was gone. Something older and far more dangerous was waking up 600 light years from Aridin Roman 4, in a cold glass office at the center of the Galactic Union Intelligence Bureau. Director Sylvan was having a quiet evening. She was Thylin, tall, thin, insected, with large dark eyes that reflected everything and revealed nothing. She had held her position for 23 years and had survived 4 galactic conflicts, 2 assassination attempts, and the daily headache of managing intelligence reports from 10,000 frontier worlds that mostly said the same thing: nothing happening. Tonight was different. Routine intercept had come in from the Aridin sector, GU military communications barely encrypted because the Gorith were too arrogant to believe anyone was listening. Most of it was standard occupation chatter, supply requests, patrol reports, complaints about the food. But one line in one report caught the attention of an automated filter, and that filter sent it to Cylon's desk. The line read: colony subjugated. Minimal resistance. 1 human resisted at an outlying homestead, neutralized his animal. No threat. Below the line, the filter had flagged the coordinates of the homestead. Sylvan almost ignored it. She processed hundreds of these reports every night, but something made her pause. She pulled up the coordinates and cross-referenced them with Galactic Union residential records for Aridin Roman 4. The name that came back made her stop breathing. She sat very still for a long time. Then she pulled up a classified file, one that required 3 separate clearance codes to access. The file was enormous. Most of it was blacked out with redaction markers. What she could read was enough. Commander Ilias Kane, the Revenant of Cassara Prime. Sylvan had been a junior analyst during the Human-Vraxian War. She remembered the reports coming in from the Cassara front. Confused, contradictory, impossible. A single human battalion had been sent to hold a mountain pass on Cassara Prime, strategic choke point that controlled access to 3 colony worlds. The Vraxians, a powerful and warlike species with superior numbers, had thrown 40,000 shock troops at that pass. The battalion was destroyed in the first 2 days. Every soldier killed, every position overrun. The Vraxians pushed through. Certain the pass was theirs, they were wrong. 1 man was still alive in the rocks. Commander Ellis Kane, wounded, alone with no reinforcements coming, picked up weapons from the dead, his own and the enemy's, and kept fighting. Not for hours, not for a day, for 11 days. The intelligence reports from the Vraxian side told the story better than any human account. Their field commanders sent increasingly desperate messages back to their high command. They called him Kelvratha, an old Vraxian word that roughly translated to the thing that will not die. They sent squad after squad into the pass. None came back whole. The human moved like smoke through the rocks, striking from angles they couldn't predict, using their own weapons against them, turning the narrow terrain into a killing ground that swallowed soldiers by the hundreds. On the 8th day, the Vraxian field commander requested orbital bombardment of the pass. The request was denied. The pass was too strategically valuable to destroy, so they sent more soldiers. By day 11, when human reinforcements finally broke through from the south, the Vraxians had lost over 12,000 troops. In the pass, 12,000 to one man. The rescue team found Kane standing at the northern mouth of the pass. His armor was shattered, his weapons were held together with wire and alien blood. He had taken wounds that should have killed him 3 times over. Around him the ground was covered in Vraxian dead, stacked so thick that in some places you couldn't see the rock beneath them. He looked at the rescue team and said, "What took you so long?" The siege of Cassara Prime broke the Vraxian offensive. They never recovered their momentum. Within a year the war was over. Military historians across the galaxy agreed that Kane's stand in the pass was the single action that changed the outcome of the conflict. He became the most decorated human soldier in galactic history. They offered him rank, power, a seat on the military council. He turned down everything. He took his discharge, took his daughter's dog, and disappeared to the frontier. Nobody heard from him again. Until now, Cylon closed the file and opened an urgent communication channel to the Galactic Union Security Council. Her message was brief. Priority Alpha Eridan Roman 4. Gorith Warbin has provoked Commander Elias Kane. Recommend immediate diplomatic intervention. This is not a warning for the human. This is a warning for the Goreth. She sent the message. Then she leaned back in her chair, looked at the ceiling, and said to no one in particular, "They killed his dog. They actually killed his dog on Eridan Roman 4. The sun had gone down and the temperature had dropped the way it always did on desert worlds, fast and sharp. The colony settlement was quiet. The Garith patrols moved through the streets in pairs, their plasma weapons glowing faintly in the dark. The colonists stayed inside, doors locked, lights off. Rennell was not inside. She was 26 years old, a field medic who had come to Eridan Roman for 3 years ago to help build a medical clinic for the frontier settlers. She was tough and practical and not easily frightened, but the last 4 days had tested her. She had treated bruises and broken bones from the Garith patrols. She had held children who couldn't stop crying. She had watched her neighbors kneel in the dirt and swallow their pride because there was no other option. She was crossing the eastern edge of the settlement, heading back to the clinic with a bag of stolen medical supplies. When she saw him, a figure was walking down the road from the direction of the outlying homesteads, walking toward the Garith base. He moved with a steady, unhurried pace, not fast, not slow, just constant, like gravity, like something that had started moving and would not stop until it reached where it was going. As he got closer, she saw the combat suit. It was old and battered, patched in a dozen places, but she recognized the design, human military, heavy infantry class, the kind they hadn't issued in over a decade. 2 rail pistols hung at his hips, an energy blade was strapped across his back, and on a chain around his neck, a dog tag caught the faint light. She couldn't read the tag from where she stood, but she didn't need to. Her grandfather had served in the human Vraxian War. He had been part of the rescue team at Cassara Prime. He had told her stories when she was young, stories she thought were exaggerations until she got older and looked them up and found out they weren't. Her grandfather had kept a picture on his wall until the day he died, a picture of a man standing in a mountain pass surrounded by the dead. The man on the road was older now, but it was the same face, the same gray eyes. "Your cane," she said. It came out as a whisper. He stopped and looked at her. His expression was empty, not angry, not sad, just empty. "You can't go out there alone," she said. "There are 300 of them, I know," he said. "They'll kill you, maybe." She stood in front of him, and she saw something in his eyes that her grandfather had described once. Look of a man who had already made peace with dying and was simply walking forward into whatever came next. "Why?" she asked. "They killed my dog," he said. It sounded simple. It sounded almost foolish, but the way he said it carried the weight of something much deeper, something that had nothing to do with the dog and everything to do with a grave behind a barn and a war he thought he had left behind, and a lifetime of loss that had finally been pushed 1 inch past what a man could bear. Renaa stepped aside. Kane walked past her and kept going, steady and constant, toward the lights of the Gorith encampment in the distance. In orbit above Aridin Roman 4, Admiral Korath stood on the command deck of his flagship and received 2 transmissions at the same time. The first was from Venter on the surface. The captain was laughing. "The human farmer is walking toward us," Venter reported, alone, wearing some kind of old armor. "He appears to be armed with antique weapons. Request permission to make a display of him for the colonists." The second transmission was from the Galactic Union Intelligence Bureau. It was a single encrypted line flagged with the highest diplomatic urgency code had ever seen. It contained no demands, no threats, no warnings. It said you should run. Korath read it twice. He looked out the viewport at the planet below. He did not understand the message. He would understand it soon. The Gorith Forward Operating Base sat on a flat stretch of dirt 2 mi north of the colony settlement. It was a proper military camp, perimeter shield, generators humming in the dark, automated gun turrets at each corner, armored transports parked in neat rows, and a command tent in the center where Venter ate his meals and told his soldiers stories about all the species he had broken. 300 Gore warriors occupied the base. Every one of them was trained, armed, and confident. They had conquered 11 colonies in the past 6 months without losing more than a handful of soldiers. They were predators at the top of the food chain, and they knew it. The night was cold and quiet. The 2 moons of Aridin Roman 4 hung in the sky like pale eyes, casting silver light across the camp. Centuries walked the perimeter in pairs, bored and relaxed. Nothing on this world was a threat. Nothing here could hurt them. Ilias Kane reached the outer perimeter. At exactly midnight, he stood in the dark beyond the range of the camp lights and studied the layout. Old habits came Back like breathing, count the centuries, mark the patrol timing. Identify the power sources, locate the command structure. His eyes moved across the base the way a surgeon's eyes move. Across a body before cutting, he had no plan to sneak in. Sneaking was for people who wanted to get in and get out. Kane wanted them to know he was there. He wanted them to see him coming and understand that it didn't matter. The first 2 centuries were standing at the eastern gate talking to each other. In low, rough voices, they were complaining about the cold. One of them thought the food supplies were running low, the other thought the captain was an idiot who didn't know how to manage resources. Neither of them saw Kane until he was already between them. The rail pistol made a sound like a whisper, a soft, sharp crack that the desert wind carried away before it reached the next patrol. Both sentries dropped. Kane stepped over them and walked into the base. He moved between the rows of armored transports. A shadow among shadows. The combat suit was old, but it still dampened his heat signature and muffled his footsteps. The rail pistols were outdated by modern military standards, but they fired tungsten rounds at 3 times the speed of sound, and at close range there was nothing in the galaxy that could stop them. The next patrol came around the corner of a supply tent. 4 soldiers walking in formation. They saw him in the same moment he raised both pistols. The engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. 4 bodies hit the ground before any of them could raise a weapon or open a mouth to shout. Kane kept moving. He reached the first perimeter shield generator and placed his hand on it. He had fought against Gorith technology before, or at least technology built on the same principles. These shields were powerful but simple. One overload charge pressed into the cooling vent at the back, and the generator would blow in 60 seconds and take the shields down across the entire eastern quadrant. He placed the charge. Then he moved to the second generator. By the time the first explosion lit up the night, Kane was already deep inside the camp. The blast woke the base. Gorith soldiers poured out of their tents, grabbing weapons, shouting orders, trying to understand what was happening. The perimeter shields on the eastern side flickered and died. Alarm systems screamed. Officers called for reports. Confusion spread like fire. Kane used that confusion like a weapon. He hit the power station next, a central unit that fed the camp's lights, turret, controls, and communications array. 2 charges placed in the fuel lines, and the station went up in a ball of white heat. The camp lights died. The automated turrets went silent. Snorts. The communications array dissolved into static. Now they were blind, deaf, and standing in the dark, and he was in there with them. What happened next would become the subject of intelligence reports across the galaxy. Military analysts would study it for years. Enemy species would use it as a cautionary tale. Kane moved through the Gorith camp the way water moves through broken stone, finding every crack, every gap, every weakness. He didn't fight like a soldier attacking a fortified position. He fought like a man who understood that 300 enemies were only dangerous if they could coordinate, and he had already taken away their ability to do that. He struck from the dark and vanished before they could turn around. He used their own vehicles as cover and their own confusion as a shield. When they fired at where he had been, they hit each other. When they formed up in groups, he hit them from the flank. When they spread out to search for him, he picked them off one by one. The Gorith were not weak, they were physically powerful. Taller, heavier, and stronger than any human. Their scales could deflect glancing blows, and their reflexes were fast. In a fair fight one-on-one, a Gorith warrior would be a serious threat, but Cain did not fight fair. He had never fought fair in his life. Fair was a concept for people who had the luxury of choosing their battles. Cain fought to win, and winning meant controlling the terms of every single engagement, choosing when to strike, where to strike, and how to disappear before the enemy could respond. Venter was in the command tent when the power went out. He grabbed his plasma blade and charged outside, screaming orders. He was a warrior. He was not afraid. He rallied soldiers around him and formed a defensive perimeter near the center of the camp. Find him, Venter bellowed into the dark. He is one human, one. Bring me his head. They tried. Groups of 10 and 20 Gore moved into the dark with weapons raised. They found their dead comrades. First dropped cleanly, efficiently, without wasted shots. Then they found nothing at all until the shots came from somewhere they weren't looking. Cain targeted their officers next. Every Gorith with gold markings on their armor was dead within 30 minutes of the first explosion. The command structure collapsed. Squads lost contact with each other. Soldiers who had never operated without direct orders didn't know what to do. Some of them held position, some of them ran, some of them shot at shadows that turned out to be their own people. An hour in, the camp was chaos. 2 hours in, it was a graveyard. Cain was wounded. A plasma bolt had burned through his left shoulder, and a Gorith blade had opened a deep cut across his ribs. He could feel the blood running down his side, warm against the cold night air. His suit's medical system was decades old. It pumped painkillers into his bloodstream and sealed the worst of the wounds with Baphomet, but it couldn't fix what was broken underneath. He didn't stop. Stopping was not something his body knew how to do. By the third hour, the surviving Gorith had pulled back to the center of the camp. There were maybe 40 of them left out of 300. They stood in a circle around the command tent, weapons facing outward. Shaking, their yellow eyes scanned the dark, looking for the thing that was killing them. Then Cain walked into the firelight. He came from the south, stepping over bodies and through the smoke. His suit was blackened and torn. Blood, his and theirs, covered him from head to boots. The rail pistols were in his hands, still warm. The energy blade across his back hummed softly. He stopped 30 ft from the circle of survivors and looked at them. Nobody moved. The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Venter stepped forward. The captain was bleeding from a wound on his leg, but he was still standing still, holding his plasma blade. His teeth were bared, but his eyes told a different story. His eyes were afraid. What are you? Venter whispered. I'm the man whose dog you killed, Cain said. His voice was flat and quiet and carried no emotion at all. I want you to understand something. All of this, everything that happened tonight, is what that costs. Venter looked at the bodies around him. He looked at his shaking soldiers. He looked at the burning wreckage of his base, and something inside him broke. Not his body, but something deeper, the understanding that he had walked onto a quiet man's porch and poked something that the galaxy had decided long ago should be left alone. You are going to send a message to your admiral, Cain said. You are going to tell him exactly what happened here. Tonight, you are going to tell him that one human did this, and you are going to tell him why. Venter's hands were trembling, but he activated his communicator, the personal one built into his armor, the only one in the camp still working, and opened a channel to Admiral Korath's flagship in orbit. Admiral Venter said, and his voice cracked, the bases destroyed the human one he couldn't finish. Kane took the communicator from him, he held it up, and spoke directly to whoever was listening above. My name is Ellis Kane. He said, your soldiers killed my dog. Now I've killed your soldiers, send more. And I'll kill them too, this is my home, leave it. He handed the communicator back to Venter, then he finished what he had started. Dawn broke over a silent camp. The orange sun rose slowly and painted the wreckage in gold and shadow. Smoke drifted up from burned vehicles and collapsed tents. Nothing moved. Kane was sitting on an overturned supply crate near the center of the camp. His shoulder was burning and his ribs screamed with every breath, and he was fairly certain he had cracked bones. He hadn't noticed during the night. The rail pistols lay across his knees empty. The colonists came at first light. They walked up the road in small, careful groups drawn by the smoke and the silence. They expected to find a battlefield. They found something closer to a statement. Renau was the first to reach him. She ran across the camp with her medical bag, dropped to her knees in front of him, and started working on his shoulder without saying a word. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were steady. Kane looked at her with tired gray eyes. I need you to do something for me, he said. What? Tell the colonists they don't have to kneel anymore. From orbit, Admiral Korath watched the sensor feed in complete silence. His bridge crew stood around him, staring at their screens. The Gorith base was gone. 300 soldiers gone. The thermal signatures showed one human still alive in the wreckage. An officer turned to Kor with wide yellow eyes. Admiral, he whispered. What is he? Korth didn't answer. He was reading the intelligence file that the Galactic Union had sent, the one he had ignored hours ago. He read the name at the top. He read the words Kessara Prime. He read the Vraxian casualty figures. And for the first time in his military career, Admiral Kor felt fear. The emergency council chamber of the Gorith Dominion was a dark circular room carved from black stone deep inside the capital world of Goratha. It was a place where wars were planned and enemies were sentenced to extinction. In 300 years of Gorith expansion, the chamber had been used only for offensive operations, planning which worlds to take, which species to subjugate, which borders to push. It had never been used to discuss a single individual. Until today, High Dominarch Sethric sat at the head of the stone table. Motionless, he was ancient even by Gorith standards. His scales had turned from green-black to deep gray, and his eyes had faded to a dull amber, but his mind was a blade that had never lost its edge. And when he watched the combat footage from Aridin Roman 4, that blade was cutting through everything his empire believed about itself. The footage was captured by the personal armor cameras of dead Gorath soldiers. It was fragmented, shaky, and dark, but it told the story clearly enough. Single figure moving through the camp. Like a force of nature, soldiers falling before they could react, defensive positions collapsing in minutes. 300 trained warriors coming apart like dry sand in a storm. The War Council watched. In silence, no one spoke, no one moved. On the screen, the figure walked through fire and smoke and death with a calm that was more terrifying than any display of rage could have been. He didn't shout, he didn't roar. He killed the way other beings breath, automatically, efficiently, without wasted motion. When the footage ended, the chamber was quiet for a long time. "Play it again," Seth said. They played it again. After the second viewing, the Dominarch turned to his intelligence chief. "Tell me everything about this." Human, the intelligence chief was a thin, nervous Garith named Vasek who had spent his career reading reports and avoiding combat. He pulled up the file on his data screen and began to speak. His voice shook. "Commander Ella's Kine, retired human military heavy infantry division, served in the human Vraxian war approximately 12 years ago. He was assigned to defend a strategic mountain pass on a planet called Kasara Prime." "I know of Kasara Prime," Sether said quietly. The Dominarch had studied the human Vraxian war. Every serious military leader in the galaxy had. It was the conflict that had changed the way the galaxy thought about humans. His entire battalion was destroyed the first 2 days of the siege. Vasek continued. Commander Kane was the sole survivor. He held the pass alone for 11 days against continuous Vraxian assault. Enemy casualties during that period exceeded 12,000. A murmur went around the table. 12,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. The Vraxians named him Kelvratha. Vasek said their word for something that cannot be killed. After the siege, he became the most decorated soldier in human military history. Snorts he was offered the highest positions their military could provide. He refused all of them. He took a discharge and disappeared to the frontier. No one in the galactic intelligence community knew his current location until last night. Sether absorbed this in silence. Then he asked the question that mattered. What happened to the Vraxians? Vase hesitated. The Vraxian Empire lost the war. They were forced into a treaty that stripped them of their military fleet and reduced their territorial holdings by 60%. They are no longer considered a significant galactic power. And they were stronger than us. Sether said it was not a question. The council shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to agree out loud, but it was true. The Vraxian Empire at its height had been one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. Their fleet had outnumbered the humans 3-1. Their shock troops had been considered nearly unbeatable, and they had lost not because they were outgunned, but because they underestimated what humans were willing to endure. Admiral Korath's face appeared on the communication screen transmitted from his flagship above Aridin Roman 4. He looked like a different creature from the confident officer he had been a day ago. His scales were pale, his eyes kept moving. "High Dominar," Korath said, "I request reinforcements." "The human, you want me to send more soldiers to die against one man?" Seth interrupted. His voice was soft and cold. "We cannot allow." "You can, and you will allow it," Seth said. "Listen to me carefully, Admiral. I am about to explain something to you that your pride has prevented you from understanding." The council leaned in. "This human is not just a soldier," Seth said. "He is a symbol. The intelligence reports make this very clear. After the siege of Kasara Prime, human military recruitment increased by 4,000%. Civilians who had never held a weapon volunteered for combat training. Colonies that had considered surrender chose to fight. One man standing in a mountain pass reminded an entire species what it was capable of. Sether let that sink in. If we send more soldiers and he kills them too, we become the next cautionary tale. If we kill him, we create a martyr, and we guarantee a war with a species that has already proven it can destroy empires larger than ours. There is no version of this where escalation serves our interests. Clenched his jaw. Then, what do you suggest, Dominarch? I suggest you survive the mistake your captain made. Pull your fleet out of the Eridan sector, all of it. Now the council erupted. Officers shouted about honor, about precedent, about the message it would send to retreat from a single planet because of a single enemy. Seth let them shout. When they were done, he spoke again. The Vraxians also talked about honor. They do not talk about much of anything anymore. That ended the argument. On the surface of Eridan Roman 4, word had traveled at the speed that important stories always travel, impossibly fast. Within hours of the Gorith base falling, the colony's emergency comm network had carried the story to every settlement on the planet. Within a day, it had jumped to neighboring systems through trading ships and civilian relays. Within 2 days, it was everywhere. The Revenant of Kisara Prime was alive. He had come out of retirement. One man had walked into a Gorith base and walked out the other side, and the reason, the part of the story that caught fire in the human imagination, was the dog. He did it because they killed his dog. Something about that detail hit a nerve that ran straight through the heart of the human species. It was not strategic. It was not logical. It was not the kind of reason that military analysts could put into a report. It was raw and emotional and deeply fundamentally human. The idea that there were things in life that mattered more than survival, more than logic, more than odds, that love, even for a small old golden-furred dog, was worth going to war over. Humans began arriving at Eridan Roman 4, not military forces. The Galactic Union had not issued any orders. No fleet had been mobilized. No call to arms had gone out through official channels. They came on their own in cargo ships and personal transports and beaten-up colony shuttles, held together with patches and hope. Veterans came, men and women who had served in the Vraxian War and other conflicts, who had hung up their weapons years ago but still kept them clean. They brought their old armor and their old rifles and their old resolve, and they landed on the dusty plains of Eridan Roman 4 and asked where they could be useful. Civilians came too. Engineers who could rebuild what the Gorith had destroyed, doctors who could treat the injured colonists, farmers who knew how to feed a growing population, teachers, mechanics, pilots, cooks, people who had no military training but who had seen the story and felt something move inside them, something that said, this matters and I should be there. Renau watched them arrive from the roof of her medical clinic, ship after ship breaking through the orange sky, landing in the flats, people stepping out and looking around at this dusty little world on the edge of nowhere. Like it was the most important place in the galaxy. Why are they coming? She asked Kane. He was sitting in a chair outside the clinic, his shoulder bandaged, his ribs wrapped, looking like a man who should be in a hospital bed, but had refused to get in. One, because they remember, he said. Remember what? What it feels like to stand up. Director Sylvan made contact with Admiral Cora through the Galactic Union diplomatic channel. The conversation was brief and devastating. Admiral Korath, she said, her dark, insectoid eyes showing nothing, I am authorized to offer you a diplomatic resolution. You may withdraw your forces from the Aridan sector, and this incident will be recorded as a border dispute. No further action will be taken. And if I refuse? Kor asked. Sylv tilted her head slightly. Then I must inform you that 67 human civilian vessels have already entered the Aridan system, and that number is growing by the hour. These are not military ships, Admiral. They are ordinary humans who heard what happened and chose to come. Imagine what will happen when the actual military arrives. She paused and let the silence do its work. You provoked one human admiral, one retired farmer with a dead dog. Look at what he did to your base. Now multiply that by the number of ships in the sky above you and ask yourself a simple question. Is this colony worth what it will cost you to keep it? Korth said nothing. The Vraxians learned this lesson, Sylv continued. They learned that there is nothing more dangerous in this galaxy than a human who has been pushed past the point of caring about their own survival, and there is only one thing more dangerous than that: an entire species that has decided to remember what it is made of. That is what is happening above your head right now, Admiral. I strongly suggest you leave before it gets worse. Communication ended. Kor stood on his bridge for a long time looking at the sensor display. The human ships were accumulating in orbit like a gathering storm. They were civilian vessels, freighters, transports, personal craft. Unarmed, most of them, but they kept coming. He thought about the combat footage. He thought about the file on Elias Kane. He thought about the Vraxians who had been stronger and more numerous and more prepared, and who had still lost everything. Admiral, one of his officers said quietly, orders. Korath closed his eyes. When he opened them, the decision was made. Set course out of the system, he said. Signal all ground forces to evacuate. We are withdrawing. The bridge was silent. Then the officer who had asked the question earlier, the one who had watched the combat footage with wide, frightened eyes, spoke up. All of this, he said softly, over an animal. Korath looked at the planet below, the dusty little world where a quiet man had buried his dog and then torn apart an army with his bare hands. No, Kor said, over what that animal meant to that man, and what that man means to a species. The Gorath fleet turned away from Aridan Roman 4 and burned hard for open space. They did not stop until they had crossed back into Dominion territory. They did not come back. 3 months passed on Aridan Roman 4, and the world became a different place. The Gorath had not just left the planet, they had pulled out of the entire frontier sector. Every colony they had occupied, every world they had claimed, every outpost they had built was abandoned overnight. The Dominion's border contracted like a fist pulling back, and the empty space they left behind filled quickly with life. New colonists arrived every week. The dusty plains that had once been home to a handful of struggling settlements now held growing towns with proper buildings, medical facilities, water treatment plants, and schools. Engineers who had arrived in those first chaotic days after the battle stayed and built. Doctors who had come to help the wounded stayed and opened clinics. The little colony that nobody in the galaxy had cared about 3 months ago was now one of the most talked about places in human space. They called it the Aridon miracle, and everybody knew why it had happened. Illis Kane wanted no part of it. He had rebuilt his homestead in the weeks after the battle quietly alone, without asking for help. The stone walls went back up, the porch was repaired, the garden was replanted. He did the work with his own hands because that was how he had always done things, and because the physical labor kept his mind busy and his thoughts away from places he didn't want them to go. The galaxy wanted to make him a hero again. The Galactic Union offered him a reinstatement at full rank with back pay. 3 different colonial governments offered him leadership positions. A human media company wanted to make a documentary about the Battle of Arid in Roman 4, and they offered him enough credits to buy his own planet. He turned down everything. He didn't answer communications. He didn't give interviews. When a reporter landed a shuttle on his property, he stood on his porch and stared at them until they left. The only person he didn't turn away was Renaa. She came by every few days at first to check his wounds, she said, because the shoulder was healing slow and the ribs had been worse than he'd admitted. She would show up at his homestead with her medical bag and a container of food from the colony kitchen, and she would work on his bandages while talking about whatever was happening in the settlement. He listened more than he spoke, which was fine with her. She was used to patients who didn't talk much. Over time, the visits became less about medicine and more about something neither of them named out loud. She brought him tools. When his old ones broke, he taught her how to fix the water purifier in her clinic. She told him about the new families arriving at the colony. He told her about the best soil on his property and which crops would grow in it. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that people share when they are carefully, slowly building a bridge between 2 lives. Kane was not easy to know. He was quiet in a way that went deeper than personality. It was the quiet of a man who had seen too much and learned that most words were not worth the energy of saying them. But Renaa had a patience that matched his silence, and she never pushed him to be more than what he was in any given moment. One evening, she found him behind the barn. He was sitting on the ground next to the 2 graves, the memorial stone with his daughter's name and the smaller mound of earth where Buddy was buried. The orange sun was going down and the sky was turning purple at the edges, and Kane was just sitting there in the fatting light with his hands resting on his knees. Renaa almost walked away. This felt like something private, but he turned his head and saw her, and he didn't wave her off, so she sat down beside him in the dirt and said nothing. They sat together for a while. Her name was Lily, Kane said. His voice was low and rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. My daughter, she was 19 when the Vraxians hit Cassara Prime. She was a civilian volunteer, helped run the evacuation shelters for the colonists. She got everyone out. Every single person in her shelter made it to the transport ships. He paused. The wind moved across the flat land and stirred the dust around them. She didn't make it to the ships herself. The shelter took a direct hit during the last bombardment. I was in the pass when it happened. I Didn't find out until after. Everything. Renaa didn't say anything, she just listened. She gave me Buddy before she deployed. He was just a pup. Then she said, "Dad, you need something to take care of that isn't a battlefield." She knew me better than anyone. A ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished. He was a good dog, patient, loyal, never cared about anything I'd done or who the galaxy said I was. He just wanted to sit with me on the porch and be together. That was enough for him. He looked at the small grave. When they killed him, something broke, not because of what they did to him, though that was enough. It broke because he was the last thing keeping me here, the last thing that needed me to be soft. Without him, the only thing left was he trailed off. The thing from Kassara, Renaa said quietly. Yeah, he let out a breath. I didn't fight those soldiers for revenge. I mean, it felt like revenge. It looked like revenge, but that's not really what it was. When they took Buddy, they took away the reason I had to not be what I used to be, and without that reason, the old version of me was all that was left. The one who doesn't stop, the one who doesn't care about the odds or the pain, or whether he walks away after. That's not a person, Renaa, that's a weapon, and I'm tired of being a weapon. She reached over and put her hand on his. He didn't pull away. You're not a weapon, she said. A weapon doesn't bury his dog. Weapon doesn't sit in the dirt talking to a grave. A weapon doesn't grow tomatoes. He almost laughed, almost. You're a man who went through something terrible and came out the other side, she said. That's not the same thing. They sat there until the stars came out and the 2 moons rose over the flat land. Then Renaa went home and Kane went inside, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something had shifted, something small and important, like a door opening an inch after being shut for years. The weeks kept moving. The colony kept growing. Kane kept tending his garden and sitting on his porch in the evenings, and the galaxy kept spinning around him the way it always had, large and loud and full of things he wanted no part of. It was on a warm afternoon 3 months and 6 days after the battle that a small girl showed up at his homestead. She was maybe 7 years old, with brown skin and dark hair and the kind of determined expression that children wear when they have been given an important mission by adults. She walked up the dirt path to his porch carrying something in her arms, a bundle of soft brown fur that wriggled and yipped. Kane was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of water. He watched the girl approach and said nothing. "Mr. Kane," the girl said in a voice that was trying very hard to be brave. "My name is Adira. My mom says you're the man who saved everybody." "Your mom is exaggerating," Kane said. "She says you're grumpy too," Adira said. "She said I shouldn't take it personally." Behind the girl at the end of the path, Kane could see a small group of colonists watching. Renaa was there, standing with her arms crossed in a slight smile on her face. Adira held up the bundle in her arms. It was a puppy, small, scrappy, with mud-cold fur and ears that were too big for its head. It looked up at Kane with round dark eyes and licked the air in his direction. "The colony took a collection," Adira said. "Not to replace your old dog," Mom said. "Nobody can replace a dog," but she said, "Maybe you could use a new friend." The puppy squirmed in the girl's arms and yipped again. Its tail was going so fast. It was a blur. Kane looked at the puppy. For a long time, he looked at the girl. He looked past her at the colonists at the end of the path, the people he had Save the people who had come from across the galaxy to build something. Here the people who were still standing because a quiet man on a porch had decided one night that enough was enough. He put down his cup of water. He reached out with both hands that had built a homestead and buried a dog and killed 300 soldiers in a single night, and he took the puppy from the girl. The puppy immediately started licking his face. Its tongue was rough and warm and ridiculous, and it squirmed against his chest like it had been waiting its whole short life for exactly this moment. Kane closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. For the first time in the story, for the first time in maybe 10 years, Elias Kane smiled. It was a small smile, and it looked like it hurt, and it was the most human thing the galaxy had seen from him since the day he walked off the killing field at Cassara Prime. "What's her name?" Adira asked. Kane held the puppy up and looked at her. She licked his nose. "Lucky," he said. "Her name is Lucky." Adira grinned. The colonists at the end of the path clapped and wiped their eyes. Renat uncrossed her arms and shook her head and smiled like someone who had just watched something important happen. Kane sat back down on his porch steps with the puppy in his lap. Lucky curled up against his chest, yawned once and fell asleep. He put his hand on her small back and felt her breathing steady, warm, alive. Behind the barn, two graves sat side by side in the quiet earth. The wind moved across them softly, carrying dust and the faint smell of growing things from the garden. Elias Kane sat on his porch with his new dog and watched the orange sun go down. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For the first time in a very long time, the silence felt like peace instead of emptiness. 600 light years away, in her glass office at the Galactic Union Intelligence Bureau, Director Sylvan filed a routine status update. It was short and marked with a classification level that very few people in the galaxy would ever see. It read: Status Update, Aridin Roman 4. Subject Kane, Ilias Commander Reed. Subject has acquired a new canine companion, homestead rebuilt, no signs of aggressive posture, continued monitoring recommended. Threat assessment to hostile parties regarding Aridin Roman 4 and surrounding sector unchanged. Addendum, personal note from Director Sylvan: do not touch the dog. The file was saved, encrypted, and distributed to every intelligence agency in the Galactic Union. Nobody touched the dog.